The tall tale we are going to read today is called Casey Jones. Casey Jones is a tall tale. Remember, tall tales are often set in the American frontier. The main character usually has an amazing or unbelievable childhood. This person usually grows up to have more amazing adventures in his or her life. Tall tale characters perform amazing deeds. Tall tales have a great deal of exaggeration, which is part of what makes them so humorous. And the characters in a tall tale are always larger than life. Americans during the frontier time often traveled from the east coast of the United States to where most of the early settlers lived, and then crossed the Appalachian Mountains to travel to the west coast. Today, we are going to start our story in the state of Kentucky. The state of Kentucky can be found here in this general area of the United States. After a time, John Henry had helped finish building the tunnels that would allow trains to go from the eastern United States to the new territories in the west. Trains were the primary mode of transportation in America. People rode on trains to get to places. The trains were used to ship items from one part of the country to another much faster than ever before. Today you're going to hear the tall tale of Casey Jones. John Luther Casey Jones was a train engineer who drove a locomotive for the Illinois Central Railroad more than 100 years ago. His real name was John Luther Jones. He was from Casey, Kentucky, pronounced the same as Casey, C-A-S-E-Y. So that's how he got the nickname Casey Jones. Casey Jones became well known for his bravery and determination. Listen carefully to discover why this story is considered a tall tale. Now gather round, friends, for I want to tell you a story. That is the story of a legendary engineer. His name was Casey Jones, and there's never been a man who could drive a train as fast or as well. People say that Casey Jones could drive a train before he could walk, and when he was a baby he'd say, "Choo, choo," instead of "coo, coo." When Casey was a young man, he grew up in Kentucky. The railroad was the fastest way to get around. This was back in the days before the airplanes and rocket ships. There were no cars and trucks. There were only horse-drawn vehicles and the mighty iron horse. That was called the locomotive. Casey was an engineer for the Illinois Central Railroad. He loved to sit up way in the cabin of the train with one hand on the whistle and the other hand on the brake. And when the tracks were straight and clear, Casey would pull that throttle and the train would go off like a rocket, shooting into space. When he came to the station, he would pull on the brake and bring the train to a sudden stop. Casey loved to watch the trees and the fields go whizzing by as he zoomed through the countryside. He loved to make that train whistle blow, and there was no other engineer who could blow a train whistle quite like Casey did. Casey's whistle started out soft, like a whippoorwill. Then it would roll to a howl like a coyote crying in the night. Finally, it faded away to a quiet whisper. People in the town always knew when Casey was coming, and even before they could see the train, they could hear it. They'd hear that powerful chugga-chugga-chugging, chugga-chugga-chugging, getting louder and louder, and they'd hear that wild whistle sounding. Some say that Casey's whistle had magic powers. They said that when Casey blew that whistle, little babies would wake up from their naps. But they would not cry. Instead, they'd make little chugga-chugga-woo-woo sounds and fall right back to sleep. When Casey blew his whistles, the cows would give an extra quart of milk, and the chickens would lay at least 1 dozen eggs each. And as the story goes, if you cracked one of those eggs in a cold frying pan and put out a piece of plain bread just as soon as Casey went blazing by, there in the pan would be a nicely fried egg over easy, and on the side a plate of hot buttered toast. Now, the reason Casey drove so fast was simple. He took great pride in being on time. Casey wanted to make sure he got the train where it had where it was to go when it was supposed to be there, no matter what. Whenever he started out a run, the railroad men would always wave and yell, "Bring her on time, Casey!" And then they knew he would. But Casey couldn't make that train go fast with his good looks. No, Casey had good firemen to help him. He had one of the best in Sim Webb. The firemen on the train didn't put out the fires like you might think. The fireman's job was to keep the fire in the engine burning by shoveling coal into it. When the flames were roaring, that made a lot of steam, and that made the train go fast. No doubt about it. Sim Webb was the first-rate fireman. He could shovel coal faster than anyone on either side of the Mississippi. The faster Sam shoveled, the faster Casey could drive that train. Sim Webb kept the fire going good and hot, and Casey Jones got the trains there on time. Together they were an unbeatable team. There was only one day that Casey and Sim almost didn't make it to the station on time. They were carrying a load of mail to Memphis, Tennessee, and it was raining cats and dogs. The rain had been falling for 5 or 6 weeks, and the railroad track had been a bed of a creek. At the station in Memphis, the railroad men waited for Casey to arrive. Some say there's no way he can make it in on time with all that rain. He'll have to slow down, but the others said, "You just wait. He'll make it." Casey Jones always makes it on time. And sure enough, then they saw the light in the tracks up ahead, and they heard a lonesome whistle. That could only be Casey Jones, and the train pulled into the station, dripping wet, puffing hard, but right on time. Casey and Sim were dog-tired, and then ready for a good night's sleep, but then they'd hardly settled into their beds when they got a knock on the door. A word came that an engineer who was supposed to drive the train in the southern-bound run was sick. Well, they didn't even have to ask Casey if he would take the man's place. Tired as he was, Casey got dressed and headed for the station. When he got there, he found Sim Webb already stoking the fire with the coal, getting the train ready to carry the mail packages of freight, and the passengers ready as well. Now, friends, here's where I have to tell you the sad part of this story. It's about how Casey met his end. As Casey mounted into the cabin and took the throttle in his hand, he heard someone shout, "Casey, you're already more than an hour and a half late." But Casey just smiled and thought to himself, that just means I'll have to go a little bit faster." Casey opened up the throttle of the train and plunged into the dark, wet night. Sim Webb shoveled the coal with all his might, and the train chugged on faster and faster. "Casey!" Sim yelled. "You're running too fast!" But Casey said, "Fireman, don't you fret. Keep knocking at the fire door and don't give up yet. I'm a-gonna run this train till she never leaves the rail, or we'll never make it on time in the southbound mail." They drove on, and the train gained speed until it was flying faster than the speed of light. Then Casey said, "I believe we'll make it through, for our engine is a-steaming better than I ever knew." Casey got the signal the tracks were clear up ahead, so he was hard-balling down those tracks, running the train just as fast as it could go. He was going so fast that it looked like they might even make it on time. Just then, they squealed around a curve, and through the darkness Casey saw a light up ahead. He knew that light wasn't supposed to be there, not on this track. At that moment, Casey knew there was a broken-down freight train stuck on the track just ahead, and he was speeding right straight for it. Casey pulled on the brake as hard as he could, and he yelled to his partner, "Jump, Sim!" "Casey, you come on," replied Sim. "Jump!" Casey shouted. In the blink of an eye, Sim jumped out, but Casey stayed in the train. He knew that he could not stop the train in time, but he knew what he had to slow it down. He knew that if he had jumped out, let go of the brake, the train would crash into the other, that dangerously high speed. So Casey pulled on that brake with all his might. The terrible screeching and squealing sound ripped through the darkness. Then crash came. The trains they met in the middle of a hill, and the head in the tangle that was bound to spill. He tried to do his duty, and all the men said, but Casey Jones just ended up dead. Poor Casey. When they found him, they said that he had one hand on the brake and the other hand tied on the whistle, trying to stop that train as best he could and give a warning to the other train. Casey Jones didn't survive that fateful ride, but he was the only person who died in that crash. Casey's bravery that night saved all the other passengers on the both trains and his fireman Sim. After that, thanks to Sim Webb keeping the story alive, people would tell stories about the brave engineer named Casey Jones. They even made up a song about him. You've already heard some of the parts of one of those songs. Here's another part. Casey Jones mounting to the cabin, Casey Jones throttle in his hand. Casey Jones mounting to the cabin, took a trip into the promised land. They say that if you look up into that sky on a clear night and see a flash of light go across the sky, well, that might be a shooting star. But then again, it might be Casey Jones roaring across the sky, chugga-chugga-chugga-chugging, on time till the end of time.